Today I'm going to show you my go-to vocal mixing chain that I use on pretty much every song. So let's hop right in and get to it. To begin with, let me go ahead and show you what the final product is going to sound like utilizing this vocal chain.
Clearly, you and me have a difference in between us, and I don't know where it leaves us, 'cause for me, I always try to be the one who makes others feel okay.
All right, so first off, I like to use the Auto-Tune Effects plugin to tune my vocal. This step is completely optional, but I like to add just a subtle amount of auto-tune, nothing crazy. It's really dependent on the genre and the sound that you're going after. Auto-tune is a very misunderstood concept in my opinion, but if you use it the right way on a vocal performance that's already sung pretty well, it's just gonna take that vocal to the next level. You see here on the retune speed knob, I have it set at 90, and this is what controls how much auto-tune you have on the vocal. So if you have this retune speed knob cranked all the way up to 0, that's where you're really gonna hear that auto-tune robotic effect on your voice, and that's typically something that I try to avoid. So set the retune speed knob where you feel like it sounds best to your ears in regards to your own vocal. I also like to set this humanize knob anywhere between 20 and 50, and this is gonna help make the auto-tune less noticeable on your vocal on those longer held out notes. Also be sure to set the key and the scale of your song so that way auto-tune knows exactly which notes to tune your vocal to. And you can also select your voice type. For me, I always select low male. Next, I use an EQ plugin to tame and remove some of the frequencies that I don't like in the vocal recording. This is the F6 EQ made by Waves. You can use any EQ plugin that you like, but this is always my go-to. So I have a high pass filter down here set at 100 Hertz, so everything under 100 Hertz is getting removed. And I usually always set this at anywhere between 80 to 120 Hertz. We really just don't need any of the frequencies down here, so getting rid of them is gonna help clean up the vocal and make space for the kick and the bass. Next, you see all these little cuts right here. These are problem frequencies that are just very harsh sounding to the ear. Now, you don't necessarily have to completely remove them from the vocal. I'm usually only taking away 3 to 4 decibels max, but it really all depends on the vocalist, the microphone, and the room that you record in. If you record in an untreated room, it can make EQing your vocal a bit more challenging, but nonetheless, the whole objective here is just to remove what you don't like from the vocal. Now, if you don't know how to listen for which frequencies are harsh sounding to the ear, a simple trick that you can do is just to take one of these EQ points and boost it by about 8 to 10 decibels, so that way you can really amplify and hear which frequencies are sticking out. Just use the frequency knob to sweep left and right until you hear that frequency that you want to remove, and then dial it back using the gain knob. The next thing we're gonna do is add some compression, and this is gonna help make the vocal more consistent volume-wise by turning down the louder peaks in the vocal. And when we decrease the difference between the louder parts and the quieter parts in the vocal, everything just becomes more even. And then we can turn the vocal up louder to be more in your face without those louder parts jumping out too much because we've controlled them with compression. So this is the Renaissance compressor made by Waves, and I don't care what anybody says, this is my favorite compressor, and I always try to use other compressors, but for some reason, I always end up coming back to this one. So I always use a 4:1 ratio. I have a pretty fast attack time. It's set at 2.5 milliseconds to catch my louder peaks. I have a medium to fast release so that the compression is in sync with the tempo of my song. If you have too slow of a release setting, you'll really hear that compressor clamping down and holding on to the signal, which is something that I typically like to avoid with, especially with vocals. Now, the next thing that I do is I play the vocal and I'll lower the threshold right here until I get about 15 decibels of gain reduction on the gain reduction meter here in the middle. The threshold basically tells the compressor at what loudness do you want to start turning down the vocal. So where you set this threshold really depends on how much compression you want. If the vocal recording is already pretty consistent, you might not need a lot of compression. But for me, I just like the sound of a heavily compressed vocal. So I'm always aiming for anywhere between 10 to 20 decibels of gain reduction. Now, you could use 2 separate compressors back to back to split up the workload. So instead of having one compressor do 20 decibels of gain reduction, reduction, you would instead have one compressor doing about 10 decibels of gain reduction, and then another compressor finishing it up with another 10 decibels of gain reduction. But like I said, the Renaissance compressor is a beast, and I think it sounds pretty good on its own. Next, I like to add some additive EQ to the vocal, meaning I use a completely separate EQ to boost certain frequencies that I like. So that first EQ plugin that we used earlier in the chain was specifically for removing frequencies that we didn't like. This EQ is for boosting frequencies that we do like. And to do this, I like using an analog style EQ. To my ears, they just add a little bit of unique character to the vocal. And this EQ plugin right here is one of my favorites. It's the Mag EQ by Plugin Alliance. And really the only thing that I'm doing is using the airband up here. It's set at about 10,000 Hertz. And I like to boost about 2 decibels or so to give the vocal some brightness in the top end. And how much you want to boost is really going to depend on which microphone you use during the recording process, and also how naturally bright the vocal already is. Just play around with how much you want to add, and if it sounds too harsh, you can dial it back a bit, or don't use any additive EQ up here in the top end at all. Something else to mention is that you don't necessarily only have to boost at 10,000 Hertz. So on other EQ plugins, I like to boost at 12,000 Hertz or 14,000 Hertz. It just so happens that this EQ plugin only offers that high shelf right here at around 10,000 Hertz. The next thing we're gonna do is add a de-esser to the vocal to take care of some of the sibilant S and T sounds that can be harsh to the ears, especially after boosting in the top end with an EQ. So this plugin right here is called Sibilance, made by Waves, and it basically acts as a compressor, but it only compresses whenever it hears sibilance. The range control right here is the maximum amount of sibilance that you want to take out, so I usually only have it set at about 20 decibels. Pulling down on the threshold knob right here will start to remove more and more sibilance as you go lower with the threshold. So you just have to play your own vocal and listen for how much sibilance you want to remove. Now you don't want to completely remove the sibilant sounds from your vocal, you just want to tame them. The mode knob over here on the right side of the plugin just controls the frequency range that will be affected by the sibilance plugin. So when you set it to wide, it's going to affect the entire frequency range. And then when you set it to split, it's going to split the signal up and only affect the high frequencies. So as you see, I like setting it right here in the middle, and I can make adjustments to this if needed, but usually it sounds pretty good right there at 50. And then over here on the left side of the plugin, we have the detection knob, and this controls what type of sibilance is detected. So if you go too far right with this knob, you're going to start to remove sounds that aren't sibilant. So that's going to make the vocals sound weird. And typically if you go above 75, that's where you're really going to have a problem. So I like to set this at anywhere between 75 and 0. So next, I like to add some saturation or distortion to the vocal in order to create some harmonics. Harmonics will make the vocals sound more full and more heavy, depending on how much you want to add. So this plugin right here is the Decapitator made by Soundtoys. It's a very simple to use plugin, but it sounds great. Down here at the bottom of the plugin, you have different emulations of analog boards and devices that create different types of saturation. So for me, I like using the first algorithm, but you can experiment and choose which one you like the best. Now, in order to operate this plugin correctly, all you have to do is increase this drive knob right here to start getting some harmonics added to your vocal. And you don't have to go crazy with it unless you want to. I'm very subtle with it, but make sure to come over here to the output gain knob and level match the volume of your vocal coming into the plugin. Because when you add harmonics to the vocal, you're gonna raise the overall volume level of the vocal because you've added saturation. Decapitator does have a auto gain switch right here, but I like to turn that off and just manually set the volume of the vocal using this output gain knob. Now, everything else on this plugin I typically don't touch. It's all just basic EQ controls down here at the bottom of the plugin. You have a mix knob if you want to dial in how much of this effect you want to add. And then you have the punish button up here, which is going to add heavy amounts of distortion. So I typically don't use that on vocals. Because remember, when it comes to saturation, you don't want to overdo it on your lead vocal unless you're specifically trying to achieve that heavily distorted sound. All right, the next thing we're going to do in this vocal chain is we're going to add some reverb. And I like to have the reverb on a send track. Basically, all this means is that we send out a copy of our lead vocal to a reverb plugin on its own mixer track. That way we have control over the sound of the reverb and the volume volume of the reverb by itself without affecting the actual lead vocal. So one of my favorite reverb plugins is this one right here. It's called the Valhalla Vintage Verb. It's a very popular, reliable, and affordable reverb plugin. And I really just love using the vocal plate preset to start with, but you can definitely customize all of the settings up here to your liking. The main thing that you want to control is going to be the pre-delay and the decay setting. The pre-delay is how long it takes for the reverb to actually kick in and start. So it's going to be the time or the space between the lead vocal and the reverb that follows. Setting the pre-delay correctly is going to prevent the reverb from sitting directly on top of the lead vocal and washing it out. It gives the vocal some space from the reverb, and I like to set it at about 25 to 50 milliseconds. And the decay setting right here is also referred to as the reverb time, and it basically controls how far the reverb extends out after the vocal. Or in other words, after the vocal ends, how long does it take for the reverb to go silent? So when I'm using plate reverbs like this one, I usually stay between 1 to 2 seconds of decay. Now the pre-delay and the decay time settings will sound best when they are in sync with the tempo of your song. I also like to have an EQ plugin loaded directly after my reverb plugin. This is going to help shape the overall tone and brightness of the reverb. So the problem with reverb is that it tends to muddy up your overall mix. So you'll see here that I cut a lot of the lows and a lot of the highs out of the reverb to help it sit in a pocket. And then the last thing to do is just blend in how much reverb you want in the mix utilizing your volume control knob. Now, just like with the reverb, I like to load a delay or an echo plugin on a separate send track. Adding an echo is an optional step, but I like to have a very subtle delay going on underneath the vocal. So this is the H delay plugin made by Waves, but again, you can use any delay plugin that you'd like. The feedback knob right here is the amount of echo taking place. So I only have this set at about 2. Over here in the bottom right of the plugin, I always make sure to turn off the analog setting. If it's left on, it's just gonna add static white noise to your mix. And then you can just experiment with the delay knob right here. This is going to control how much of a line is going to be repeated. Now, I used to set this at an 8th note or a 16th note where it was quickly repeating words, but as of late, I've actually been experimenting with taking this to a quarter note or a half note where the whole entire line is being repeated. And it all depends on the tempo of the song, but once you get that echo right, you can blend it in volume-wise and tuck it in underneath the lead vocal. And I set the volume of this delay at a level to where I don't even really hear it, but when I mute it, I notice something is missing. It's really just there to help create an atmosphere or space for the vocal to sit in. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Leave me a comment, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.